Twilestia by Anonymous Pegasus. Twilight Sparkle chased a rogue pea across her plate with her fork, listening to Princess Luna babble on about the night skies, constellations, and royal duties. She was trying hard to appear interested, but her head was buzzing from one of Pinkie Pie's late-night parties, and the lack of sleep was showing. "Are you okay, Twilight Sparkle?" Luna asked, concerned. Since the wedding, her English had improved majorly, as long as she was calm and collected. "Just a little tired," Twilight admitted with a wry smile. "You should sleep earlier. Students need many hours a night to keep their minds fresh," Luna said with a gentle nod, pushing her mane out of her eyes. Twilight nodded in acquiescence at that, yawning faintly and then spearing the pea with her fork, pulling it up to her mouth, chewing on it idly. After the wedding, Luna had taken a more active role towards social activities. From lunch dates and parties to managing the Canterlot Public Library in her spare time, the princess was spending more time interacting with others. Little did Twilight know, however, that Luna's spare-time job had caused her to uncover the unicorn's journal. It had proved an interesting read to the princess, containing theories on the time-space continuum, relativity, and many other subjects. Littered throughout the journal, however, were various references to the unicorn's relationship with Celestia. A relationship that the unicorn obviously wished to be deeper than just teacher and student. The final entry in the journal was a series of angry strokes denoting the unicorn was being sent all the way to Ponyville for an undisclosed length of time, further away from the princess. Luna had found the journal, tucked neatly in a book on Star Swirl the Bearded, when she was reorganizing those books that Twilight had left behind and forgotten about. The princess had already sounded out Celestia over cups of tea, discovering that her sister was aloof with reason. She was a goddess, after all. A young unicorn would hardly take to that kind of attention in stride. Celestia feared that any overt advances, or even mentions of such, would create a rift between herself and Twilight, and even that information was only gleaned after Celestia was tipsy. "Have you visited Canterlot recently?" Luna asked carefully, perking an ear at the unicorn. Twilight looked up from her plate, head canting slightly to the side. She shook her head gently. "I haven't been to Canterlot since the wedding." Luna lowered her gaze to the table and gave a gentle nod. "Ah, that would be why then." Twilight's ears perked up at that, and she lifted her head, brows raising. "Why what?" Giving a deliberate pause to feign recalcitrance, Luna bit her bottom lip, affecting a look of nervousness. "Oh, it's just that Celestia becomes aloof when she does not interact with you for long periods of time." "However do you mean?" Twilight asked curiously, head canting to the side. "I probably shouldn't say any more," Luna said with a false strain in her voice, shaking her head. "You've got me curious now," Twilight pressed, placing her forehoof on the table. Luna looked away, feigning nervousness. "Well, Celestia likes you," Luna murmured, deliberately keeping her voice low to make her manipulations believable. Twilight swallowed hard, her cheeks flushing. Likes me?" Luna nodded gently. "I believe so. But it's not like she can do anything about it, right? I mean, you're a unicorn, she's a goddess. Plus, you're pretty young, and you don't have any interest in her, right?" The unicorn flushed deeply as Luna stared at her pointedly. "Well, I guess not." "Don't tell her I said anything," Luna said suddenly, splaying her ears back. "She'd never even admit it. You'd have to walk right up to her and kiss her to even get a reaction." "I won't tell her," Twilight said, shaking her head, before pushing away from the table. I have a letter to send." Luna nodded gently. Perhaps we can have lunch again next week? I'd like that, Twilight said with a distracted smile, beginning to quickly stride away towards her library. Princess Luna smiled as she watched the unicorn speed away. Events had been set in motion, it seemed. Twilight tentatively lifted a hoof, knocking on Celestia's door. The unicorn's cheeks were flushed with warmth, and she shifted nervously from hoof to hoof as she listened intently. Hoofbeats made their way over to the door. There was a pause, and then the door opened. Celestia raised an eyebrow down at her student, ears pricking upwards curiously at her. Twilight, I admit, this is a surprise. Twilight gave a nervous nod, looking up at the princess, her eyes wide and her heart thudding. Now that she was actually here, she had no clue what she intended to do. From what Luna had said, Celestia had feelings for her, and Twilight definitely had feelings for the princess. But what? Was she going to just blurt out that she had feelings for the princess? The princess tilted her head slightly to one side, a brow arching further upwards. Twilight? Twilight shook her head to clear it, and then peered up at Celestia, shifting her weight from hoof to hoof nervously. Can I come in? Celestia gave a thoughtful hum at that, eyeing her student suspiciously before giving her a gentle nod. Come in, Twilight, she said, taking a step back to give the unicorn space to enter. The young unicorn stepped through the open doorway, nervously standing beside the door as Celestia closed it. It was not the first time that Twilight had been in Celestia's personal chambers, but this felt somehow different. Somehow, knowing that Celestia was interested in her didn't make it any easier to broach the subject. Come, sit, Celestia said, smiling warmly as she settled herself down on the rug in the center of the room, where she usually laid to read or compose letters. Twilight nervously made her way over to the rug, standing there awkwardly as Celestia gracefully turned in the center of the rug and dropped down onto her stomach, twitching her wings, arranging them into a more comfortable position. The young unicorn stepped over next to Celestia and sat down carefully on the edge of the rug, making sure not to touch the princess. So, why did you come? Celestia queried, ears perking up as she peered sideways at her student. Twilight stammered, her ears splaying backwards. Well, I wanted help with a book. Celestia arched a brow at her student, her expression suspicious. A book, you say? I see no book. Twilight flushed at that, realizing that she had been caught in a lie. Luna told me you like me, Twilight blurted suddenly. Her ears splayed in embarrassment. Celestia went silent at that, looking away. I'm sorry, she whispered quietly. Twilight shook her head hurriedly. No, she tried to soothe, shuffling closer to the princess nervously. I don't mind, really. Celestia raised a brow at that again, peering at her student. What do you mean? I mean, I just... Twilight trailed off, unable to articulate how she felt. She lifted a hoof to rest on Celestia's shoulder, the unicorn's cheeks flushing further. I like you too, Princess Celestia. There was another pause then, as Celestia processed the words, looking down at her forehooves for a few moments, and then back up at her student. Do you know what you're talking about, Twilight? Twilight looked away, avoiding the princess's gaze, nodding firmly. I know. Celestia was at a loss for words, and Twilight was surprised at that. Celestia always knew what to say. Princess? Twilight asked uncertainly. need time to think," Celestia said, trailing off with a slow shake of her head. Twilight shook her head again, taking a deep breath, lifting her hoof to touch at Celestia's cheek. "No thinking," Twilight breathed, her cheeks burning. Celestia lifted her head to stare at her student, brows raising. "But—" Twilight cut the princess off by leaning in and kissing her full on the mouth with no hesitation. The princess paused, caught off guard, tensing for a moment, and then relaxing, humming faintly into the kiss her student was pressing on her. After several long moments, Twilight drew back, panting faintly for breath, a soft shudder pressing through her form. Celestia stared down at her, her expression unreadable. The soft whisper of the alicorn's feathers rustling together as her wings twitched was loud in the silence. Twilight flushed, her ears pinned back, her head hanging. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have done that." Celestia shook her head, lifting a hoof to shush her student, and then leaning in for another kiss, pressing their lips together gently. The princess's wings fluttered slightly in excitement, and her tail swished once. For her part, Twilight was more composed, but her cheeks were flushed and her own tail was twitching erratically. Once more the kiss was broken, and the two mares panted softly to catch their breath. "Where do we go from here?" Twilight asked, her ears splayed. "I haven't studied this stuff." "This is not something you can study, Twilight," Celestia gently chided, shaking her head and laying a hoof over the unicorn. Twilight's cheeks flushed again, and she looked away. "I disagree." "You disagree?" Celestia asked, curious. "I've seen, well, 1 or 2 books," Twilight admitted, refusing to meet Celestia's gaze again. "Books detailing what to do in awkward situations such as this?" Celestia queried, head tilting inquisitively to the side. Twilight flushed faintly and then shook her head. "Well, I guess not about this specifically." "Then which books do you refer to?" Celestia pressed, nudging her student gently with her nose. The young unicorn looked away again, stammering faintly. "They were, romance novels." Celestia blinked once at that, before giving a soft chuckle. "Ah, my dearest student, have you been reading Moons and Bits novels?" Twilight shuddered faintly, and shook her head silently. It was an old story, based on a creation myth." The princess gave a hum at that, looking down at her student thoughtfully. "Explicate?" Twilight flushed a little bit more, hiding her nose behind a hoof. "Well, it was about you." Celestia blinked once, her head canting to the side. "You and Luna," Twilight further elaborated. Celestia's cheeks flushed faintly at that, and her ears pricked up. "A story about me and my sister?" Twilight nodded, flushing faintly. "Tell me more, dearest student," Celestia urged, nudging her again. "Well, I kinda just skipped to the good bit," Twilight admitted, face flushed a crimson color. "And that was?" Celestia asked in a knowing tone. The naughty stuff," Twilight whispered, turning her head away, blushing hard. "And why did you skip there?" Celestia asked with a smile in her voice. You already know why," Twilight stammered, shaking her head helplessly. "But I want to hear you say it," Celestia said with a warm smile. Twilight shuddered faintly, her hooves tensed on the rug as she tried to still her reflexive reactions. Because I'm attracted to you. Celestia gave a wry smile at that, her wings flicking slightly as she leaned in to nuzzle her student. Did you masturbate to it? Twilight's eyes widened at the bluntness of the question. Her stammered answer was obviously a lie. No. You would lie to your princess? Celestia asked delicately, a smile tugging at her lips. The young unicorn looked up at Celestia, eyes wide, her heart pounding. Maybe I did, she stammered, flushing hard and looking away. A low, thoughtful hum left the alicorn, and she shifted, tugging Twilight against her, and then rolling onto her rump, with her back resting against the wall, wings spread for balance. Twilight's back was pressed to her chest and stomach, the young unicorn sitting between the princess's splayed legs, while Celestia's forehooves wrapped around Twilight's middle. Twilight squeaked faintly at being moved, but allowed it, shuddering faintly and then leaning back against the princess, looking up at her upside down. Celestia gave a pleasant hum, leaning in to kiss the unicorn's nose, smiling. Did you use your hooves? Celestia asked brazenly, one of her own hooves pressing down Twilight's form, slowly rubbing against her stomach. Magic, perhaps? Twilight flushed deeply at the question, unsure how to respond, biting her bottom lip as Celestia took one of the unicorn's ears into her mouth and gently nibbled at the edge of it. A toy? Celestia asked after a moment. Twilight squeaked once and shook her head vigorously. Celestia smiled at that, giving a low, eager hum, leaning in to swirl her tongue gently across Twilight's horn. A toy, she repeated, feeling her student shudder against her, giving her all the affirmation she needed. Such a naughty unicorn. The young unicorn squirmed helplessly in the clutches of the princess, worming back against her gently in reflexive motions as she felt the tongue on her horn. Tell me about the toy. Celestia purred into Twilight's ear, biting down on it hard enough to elicit a cry from her student, but not hard enough to harm her. What do you want to know? Twilight panted, peering up at the princess with lidded eyes, the blush visible in her cheeks. Celestia gave a low, thoughtful sound at that, nibbling along the tip of Twilight's ear, her hoof still rubbing dangerously low at Twilight's stomach. Everything, Celestia decided, her wings flaring, the feathers twitching eagerly. Size, shape, color? Twilight shuddered again, her face and ears burning as she closed her eyes and tried not to pay any attention to the sensations that Celestia was bringing up in her with the nibbles to her ears and those teasing licks to her strangely sensitive horn. Well, it's kind of big, Twilight started, faltering over the words with the nervousness and the sensation of Celestia both nibbling at her ears and working that hoof over her lower stomach. Why big? Celestia asked suddenly, giving a devious grin down at her student. Twilight flushed again, staring down at her hind legs, which were twitching reflexively every time Celestia's hoof strayed a little too close to that needy area between them. Because I've found that the smaller kinds of toys don't give enough stimulation. They're all too smooth, and there's no contours. Celestia gave an eager growl at that, biting her student's ear again, making the unicorn squeak and writhe. Tell me more. Well, mine is modeled after a hydra. Twilight admitted, flushing deeply once more, her ears splaying backwards. The removal of her target caused Celestia to lean forward and begin swirling her tongue along the unicorn's horn again. "Why a hydra?" Celestia purred into one of Twilight's ears, tongue curling around the length of her smooth horn. The shape of the hydra is the most stimulating," Twilight admitted, flushing deeply again. The medial ridges offer more stimulation, and the bulbous glanus offers more unique stimulation when it's inserted. Twilight fumbled over the last few words, her face burning crimson as she explained to her teacher, the princess, exactly what kind of special attributes her toy had. "The knot, Twilight," Celestia purred, husky, into her student's ear. "Tell me that you like the knot." Twilight's eyes widened, and she bit her bottom lip again, eyes clenching closed, squirming against her teacher. I like the knot," Twilight stammered, fumbling with the slang word, feeling dirty just saying it. "Why do you like it so much?" Celestia asked with a grin, biting at the top of her student's splayed ears again. The bulbi, the knot," Twilight corrected herself, stammering, "lets me keep it inside while I'm reading, and it—" Twilight trailed off, then gathering up the courage to finish the sentence. "I like how it feels when I— Twilight broke off into a panting gasp as Celestia's hoof finally reached its destination, pressing between her hind legs and rubbing directly up against the neglected, eager lips of her already drooling cunt. "Did you use it when you read the story about me, Twilight?" Celestia asked naughtily, grinning and then taking the tip of her student's horn into her soft maw, sucking around it gently. A helpless shudder left the unicorn as she felt stimulation both in her aching sex and at the tip of her sensitive horn, her entire form arching slightly against the princess, her hind legs spreading further on reflex. "No, not the first time," Twilight panted, shaking her head. "The first time?" Celestia asked with a sly grin, drawing off of Twilight's horn with a slow swirl of her tongue along the length of it. "You have read the story many times?" Twilight gave a shaky nod, and then shuddered as Celestia gave an extra hard grind between her spread hind legs. I cannot adequately simulate a tongue, though." "Didn't you try your own?" Celestia suggested with a naughty grin, grinding her hoof between Twilight's thighs eagerly. The edges of it were already wet with the unicorn's liquids. Couldn't reach," Twilight admitted, her face burning again. She unwrapped her hooves from Twilight's body and leaned back slightly, licking at her messy hoof slowly. "Turn around, Twilight. Lay down on your back." Twilight squeaked faintly at the request, her ears pinning back, her breathing increasing in speed and intensity. Shuddering, she did as asked, leaning forwards and dropping onto her stomach before rolling over carefully, spreading her hind legs. With her legs spread like that, Celestia could see everything, where Twilight's fuzzy purple fur faded out around the soft, pliable-looking edges of her already moist sex, and the faint sheen of moisture visible on the pink that was faintly noticeable between. Twilight arched and cried out in surprise and delight as Celestia fell on her, her muzzle burying between her student's spread thighs, lips contacting her puffy, aroused sex. Hooves flying to her muzzle, Twilight tried to contain her squeaks, even as Celestia began to lap at her powerfully, drawing a series of long, firm licks across the pliable lips of her student's cunt, spreading her open slightly with the pressure, and allowing the velvet tongue to swirl directly against the exposed pink flesh. Stifling her cries, Twilight rolled her hips in reflex, meeting the eager lapping of Celestia's warm tongue with emotions, trying to eke out another little bit of stimulation from the firm, rapid licks. The unicorn's eyes clenched closed, and she curled helplessly, hooves wrapping around her teacher's head as she ground her hips towards the delightful sensation between her legs. Something poked her nose, and Twilight opened one eye to find Celestia's horn in front of her. With a low moan, Twilight sank her mouth over the horn, closing her lips over it and sucking at it powerfully, giving muffled sounds of delight around it as the alicorn worked between her legs so eagerly. Celestia already had a hoof pressed between her own thighs, rubbing firmly up against her drooling cunt, while she assaulted Twilight's own sex with her eager laps and tongue swirls. Her free hoof was curled around Twilight's rump, helping to hold the unicorn close and spread, allowing her to dig her tongue just that much further into the heated, wet folds of her student's eager cunt. Twilight whimpered softly around the pointed spire in her muzzle, her ears pinned back and chest heaving as she panted and shuddered, rolling her hips in helpless reflex. Princess, I'm going to climax. Come, Twilight, Celestia panted as she drew back from the unicorn's quivering sex. Say it, Twilight, she demanded, grinning breathlessly as she leaned back down to attack Twilight's clit with rapid, eager swirls of her tongue. Twilight flushed helplessly, her ears splaying back, her hips and hind legs twitching as she felt it rise up within her. I'm going to Twilight never finished her sentence, as Celestia leaned in and closed her lips over her student's clit, sucking powerfully and then tugging back, sending a jolt of pleasure through the young unicorn's form. Twilight writhed and shuddered, squeezing Celestia's head as she bucked her hips reflexively, repeated slick gushes of her orgasmic fluids drooling from her quivering cunt as she cried out in delight. After several long moments, Twilight relaxed, releasing Celestia's head with a low groan, before splaying out on her back, spent. Celestia gave a low, delighted hum, lapping firmly at her student's puffy cunt, cleaning up the orgasmic fluids. The scent of Twilight's lust was strong in her nose, and some of her clear liquids had even splashed across the princess's muzzle, dripping slowly from her cheeks and chin. It took very little effort for Celestia to reach climax, grinding her hoof against herself eagerly as she tongued at her tired student's body. Princess Luna carefully pushed open the door to Celestia's private chambers, peeking in. Celestia had been late to raise the sun that morning, and it had fallen to Luna to take up her sister's duty on the interim. It had been over 1,000 years since the last time Celestia had failed to raise the sun on time, and then it had been a grave incident that was the cause. A slight expression of surprise found Luna's face as she caught sight of Celestia, still asleep. She was resting on her side on the rug, in the center of the room, spooning with Twilight. Twilight likewise was fast asleep. Celestia's wing was resting over Twilight, and one hoof was possessively lain over the smaller form of the unicorn. Their heads rested side by side on the rug. Luna even fancied that they were both smiling. Very carefully Luna pulled back and closed the door, making as little noise as possible, not wanting to disturb the two. She nodded to the guards. "Allow my sister to sleep. I will tend to her royal duties for the day. She deserves this much," Luna said to the two guards as she headed for the throne room. She was surprised that it had only taken so little time for Twilight and Celestia to end up together after dropping that hint at the lunch date, but she was happy that the two had found each other. And the image of the two mares, sleeping side by side, entangled like that, was a pleasant image indeed.